It was the winter of 1888, and the prairie winds were cruel as a hangman's noose. Snow had been falling for near 3 days, piling high against cabins and lean-tos, burying fence posts and dreams alike. Folks huddled round their stoves like moths to a lantern, whispering prayers to outlast the cold. Grace Hamilton didn't have the luxury of whispering. She was out in that blizzard, cloak flapping, boots soaked through, her father's trading post vanishing behind her in the white. She'd had enough of the talk, the side eyes, the judgment. A woman working around liquor, they said. A woman with too much spine and not enough shame. They never said it to her face, but she heard it all the same, whispers thin as frost on a window pane. The wind screamed like a banshee. Grace couldn't feel her fingers. She couldn't even feel her ankle no more after it twisted on a hidden creek bed. Just pain and ice and fear, and the sense that she might die out here, unknown and unwept, buried under a drift before spring had a chance to find her. That's when he found her. Caleb Mason wasn't looking for no one. Man like him kept to himself, kept his fire hot and his tongue cold. But when he heard that cry through the gale, he didn't hesitate, grabbed his lantern, bundled up, and plunged into the white like it owed him answers. He found her half buried near the timberline, one boot off, eyes glassy with the kind of look a body gets when they're leaning toward the next life. He didn't say a word, just scooped her up, cradled like you would a broken bird, and carried her back through the teeth of the storm. She woke to warmth and light, his cabin small but solid, fire crackling, stew on the stove. Her head ached, her ankle throbbed, but she was alive, and not alone. Caleb sat across from her, fixing her foot with steady hands. He'd taken off her boot, but left her dignity, wrapped her in every spare blanket he had, and even gave her the bed. Takin, the hard floor himself. She tried to speak, but he held up a hand. "Later," he said, voice deep and sure. "You ain't strong enough for talking foolish just yet." Grace didn't know what to make of him. He was plain as rawhide, beard rough, eyes gray like winter sky, but there was kindness under that weather-beaten face. He didn't ask who she was, didn't ask why she was out there, just saved her, like it was the natural thing to do. She fell asleep again with the firelight dancing against the log walls, and the sound of a slow breathing, the only thing reminding her the world hadn't ended. But the world had noticed. When the storm cleared and Sunday morning came, the townsfolk found her horse near froze at the edge of the Mason place. They followed the trail through the snow, Sheriff Knoxley it in, a few churchgoers in tow, and what they saw near brought their tongues to the floorboards. A woman, alone, in a man's cabin, overnight. Didn't matter he'd saved her life. Didn't matter he hadn't touched a hair on her head. What mattered was appearances. And in a town ruled by snow and sermons, appearances was gospel. Sheriff pulled off his gloves slow, cleared his throat. "Well, Caleb, you know what's got to be done." Caleb looked from the sheriff to Grace, then back again. His jaw worked like he was Chewenine. "I didn't do nothing but keep her from dying." "That might be so," the preacher said, stepping forward. "But the town'll have its talk, and talk turns to judgment." Grace sat up in the bed, eyes fierce despite the fever still clinging to her. "You'd rather I'd died than been saved and proper?" "Course not, miss," the sheriff said, hat in hand. "But if you stay here another night, there'll be no salve on your reputation." That was when old Widow Morley, sharp as a bramble and twice as thorny, crossed her arms and declared what the rest were already thinking. "Well, I reckon if she's gonna stay the night again, they ought to make it proper." Caleb Mason had never been one to take orders lightly, not from lawmen, preachers, or the gossiping wind. But there he stood in the doorway of his own cabin, hat in hand, staring down half the town like a schoolboy caught smoking behind the church house. Grace sat propped up behind him, her cheeks flushed, not from fever now, but fury. She wasn't no hothouse flower to be plucked and traded because folks got nervous seeing a woman warm. "Let me get this straight," she said, her voice cutting through the morning air like a sharpened sickle. "Man saves me from freezing, feeds me, tends my wounds, and now you say he's got to marry me to make that decent?" Widow Morley sniffed. "It ain't about what he did or didn't do, child. It's about what's already been seen." Caleb didn't look at her, not yet. He just watched the sheriff like a bear watching a rattler slither a little too close. "I ain't ever forced my name on a woman," he said slowly. "And I sure as thunder ain't gonna start now, cause of loose tongues and moral panic." Grace leaned forward, wincing as her ankles shifted under the blankets. "And I ain't marrying a man just to clean up a story that ain't even mine." There was a silence then, a long one. You could have heard snow melt on the roof. But the sheriff, poor man, he was caught between the devil and the church pew. "I know how this looks," he said, "but the town's breathing down my neck. Pastor Josiah's threatening to call a town meeting. And if he does, it won't be about justice. It'll be about shame." Caleb let out a breath slow and deep. "What are you saying, Knox?" "I'm saying you got two choices. Either she stays here under your protection, and folks see that ring on her finger by sundown, or she comes back with us to stay in Widow Morley's parlor till a more suitable arrangement can be made." Grace looked at Caleb then, and for the first time since he'd carried her in out of the storm, he met her gaze. Something passed between them. Not romance, not yet, but an understanding. "A choice. I ain't gonna lock you in a cage you didn't ask for," he said. "But I'll tell you straight. If you say the word, I'll do what needs doing. Won't mean we're beholden to each other past your healing. Won't mean I expect nothing." Grace studied him. He wasn't bluffing. He wasn't begging either. Just off errand, like a man setting out a second chair at his table and waiting to see if it got filled. She looked out at the crowd, at Widow Morley's tight-lipped judgment, at Pastor Josiah's raised brow, at Sheriff Knox's weary eyes. And then she looked back at Caleb. "All right," she said, voice steady as a pickaxe, "but we do it my way." He blinked. "Your way. You want a wedding. You'll get one. But I'll stand on my own 2 feet to take those vows, not on a sickbed. And when we speak, it'll be in front of God and nobody else. Not these whispering tongues and porch watchers." She paused. "You still willing?" He nodded once, slow. "Then I reckon I am." So they made their decision. Not out of love, not out of passion, but out of stubbornness, and maybe a little something stronger underneath. The crowd dispersed, some disappointed there weren't no shouting or scandal. The preacher muttered something about short notice and needing time to polish his sermon. Caleb turned back to the cabin, closed the door behind them both, and leaned against it with a sigh. "That was one heck of a proposal," he said dryly. Grace smirked. "You ain't seen nothing yet." 3 days passed. Grace healed quick for someone who nearly froze to death. Quicker still when pride was part of the medicine. She wouldn't let Caleb wait on her, no matter how polite he tried to be. She propped herself up on a cane she carved from a pine branch, limped around the little cabin doing what she could, sweeping floors, fixing a stew, even patched up the tear in his coat without a skin. Caleb didn't say much. Never did. But he noticed. He always noticed. "You don't owe me chores," he said one night, as she stirred a pot on the stove. She glanced over her shoulder, steam curling around her face. "And you don't owe me a wedding. But here we are." He grunted, went back to whittling. Man had a way of saying whole paragraphs without parting his lips more than a few inches. That night, she sat by the fire with the blanket pulled tight round her shoulders, listening to the wind scratch at the window panes. "You ever been married before, Caleb?" He shook his head. Came close once. She didn't take to the idea of winters this far north. Grace chuckled. "Smart woman." He looked over, eyes steady. "Maybe. But she didn't have your kind of grit." The words hung there between them, warm and unexpected. The next morning, they walked, limped and strode, down to the edge of the grove behind the cabin. It was quiet back there. Just trees, snow, and the soft hush of wind through pine needles. That's where they said their vows. No preacher, no guests, just them and the land, and a plain silver ring Caleb had traded for 2 weeks' worth of smoked meat down at Dunn's Mercantile. He placed it on her finger, with hands calloused and careful. "You sure about this?" he asked, voice low. Grace smiled, tired but proud. "I've never been more sure of anything I wasn't sure about at all." And that was how it was done. Not with lace and flowers, not with songs and speeches, Just firelight, frost, and two folks making a promise not for love, but maybe for the possibility of it. Back at the cabin, she hung her shawl by the door, settled into the single cot, with barely a blink. Caleb made no move toward her, just tossed his blanket down by the fire, like he'd done every night since she arrived. But Grace, staring up at the low beams overhead, said softly, "It's your bed too now, husband. I ain't gonna bite." He paused at the hearth, his back to her. "Not unless I deserve it, I hope." She smiled into the dark. "Don't tempt me." The wind howled outside, but inside was quiet, safe. Two strangers who'd made themselves a storm shelter out of shared stubbornness, and a spark they hadn't yet named. They spent the next week adjusting to the awkward dance of being strangers wearing rings. The silence grew easier between them, comfortable, like a worn-in saddle. Grace found a rhythm in the cabin, mending clothes, stirring beans, organizing Caleb's scattered tools in ways that made him grunt and mumble but never move him back. Every morning, she watched the sun rise through the frosted glass, while Caleb chopped wood in the yard. He worked with the same quiet focus he gave everything, like even swinging an axe was a sacred act. She couldn't help but admire the man's steadiness. In a world built on sand, Caleb Mason was solid as stone. But peace in these parts don't last long. It was a Tuesday, crisp and brittle, when the trouble started knocking. Literally, the rap on the cabin door came early, before breakfast. Caleb opened it slow. Hand near the rifle leaned up by the wall. Sheriff Knox stood there, snow on his shoulders and a frown buried beneath his mustache. "Caleb," he said, tipping his hat at Grace behind him. Mrs. Mason. "Morning." "Sheriff," Caleb said, voice like gravel. "We got a visitor in town. Name of Jud Brody. Claims he's kin to your bride." Grace's spine stiffened. The wooden spoon in her hand dropped to the table with a clatter. "Jud Brody," she repeated, her tone flat. "My uncle." Knox nodded. "Says he's here to reclaim what was stolen." Caleb's fingers curled slow, deliberate. "Stolen. Says you ran off with family property, that he's your rightful guardian, and you weren't never authorized to leave Cedarville." Grace stood tall, wounded pride flaring. "He's a liar. Ain't no guardian ever swung a switch like he did. I left with the clothes on my back and nothing of his but peace of mind." Knox looked uncomfortable. "I ain't saying he's right, but folks are talking. He's stirring up noise. Wants a meeting with you both tomorrow. In town." Caleb's jaw ticked, but he gave a single nod. "We'll be there." When the door shut, Grace turned to Caleb. Her face was pale, but her eyes burned fierce. "You don't have to get involved," she said. "He's my past. I won't let him poison your life, too." Caleb looked at her for a long moment, then said, "He put marks on you?" Grace didn't flinch. "Once, maybe twice. That's once too many." He reached for her hand, rough fingers folding around hers gentle-like. "You're my wife now, Grace, whether we planned it or not, and I reckon that means your past is part of my present." That night, they ate in silence, but not the cold kind. The fire burned steady. Outside, the snow kept falling. But inside, there was warmth, and more than just from the stove. Caleb sat watching the flames while Grace leaned against the window frame, staring at the white beyond. "You ever think," she asked quietly, "that all this might have happened for a reason?" Caleb didn't answer right away. Then, "Reckon I don't put much stock in fate, but I believe in the storm bringing what's needed, if not what's wanted." She smiled faintly. "And what am I?" He looked at her, eyes deep and still. "Maybe both." Next morning, the sky was a dull gray bruise, swollen with the promise of more snow. Caleb hitched the wagon while Grace wrapped herself in her best shawl, clean, mended, but still plain. She didn't own much, but what she had, she wore proud. The ride into town was quiet, but it wasn't heavy. More like two folks loading their rifles before dawn, calm, careful, waiting for the first shot to ring out. When they reached the meeting hall, folks were already gathered. The preacher was there, of course. Widow Morley, too, chin high like she smelled something sour. And leaning against the hearth, like he owned the place, stood Jud Brody. He hadn't changed much. Still built like a fence post, tall, lean, and twisted with knots. His coat was long, black, and dusty. His hat shaded eyes that looked like they'd seen too much, and like most of it. "Well now," he drawled when he saw her. "Ain't you a picture? You was always a little fire starter, Grace. And now you're playing house with a stranger." Grace stood tall. "I ain't playing. And he ain't a stranger. He's my husband." Jud's mouth curled. "You think a ring makes it right? Girl, you been running fair years, from every rule ever set for you. I came here to bring you home." Caleb stepped forward then. Not loud, not quick, just solid. "She is home." Jud's eyes flicked to him, sized him up like a man measuring a bull he might have to shoot. "And who are you to say so?" "Her husband. Her shelter. Her shield if need be." A murmur rippled through the room. Grace reached for Caleb's hand without looking. Their fingers found each other like they'd been doing a lifetime. Sheriff Knox raised a hand. "Judge, she's married now. There's no claim you can make that overrides a union sanctioned by the town and the Lord." Jud's jaw ticked. "She's got things belong to me." Grace's voice snapped like a whip. "I took nothing but the name my mother gave me and a pair of boots too worn to steal. What you want, Jud, is control, and you ain't got that no more." For a moment, the air in the room turned thin. Then Jud sneered. "Don't matter. You'll come crawling back. Storms pass, and so do good men. But debts, they always find their way home." He turned and strode out, leaving the scent of old tobacco and fresh trouble behind him. The hall emptied slow. Some folks nodded at Caleb. Some avoided Grace's eyes. But it didn't matter. Not anymore. Back at the cabin, Caleb shut the door behind Em and leaned his hat on the peg. "He'll be back," he said simply. "I know," she replied, "but so will spring." That night, they didn't talk much. But when Caleb laid down, Grace didn't wait for an invitation. She slid in beside him, close but not clingy. Her head rested just near his shoulder, breath slow and steady. Neither of them said it, but they both knew. The war was coming. But for the first time in a long while, neither of them would be fighting it alone. The days that followed were heavy with watching. Caleb kept his rifle leaned by the door and checked the traps twice as often. Grace kept the kettle hot and her eyes on the horizon. It wasn't fear exactly, it was readiness. Like standing in a doorway waiting on a storm you know's coming. But it wasn't just tension that hung in the air. There was something else brewing between them. Not quite romance, not yet, but comfort, respect, a quiet sort of affection born of shared burdens and borrowed strength. One night, a week after the showdown with Jud, the air turned strange, warm for February, the kind of wind that smelled of thaw and trouble. Grace stood out on the porch, arms crossed, breath fogged in front of her. Caleb came up behind her, silent as ever. "He's still out there," she said. "Yep." She turned to him. "If he comes here, what'll you do?" Caleb didn't answer right away, just looked out across the snow-covered field, where the moon made silver ghosts of the fence posts. "I'll protect what's mine." She bristled a little, then caught the meaning in his tone. It wasn't ownership he spoke of. It was loyalty, vow-bound and blood-deep. She softened. "What if I told you I don't want to be protected? I want to fight beside you?" He met her eyes. "Then I reckon we'll stand back to back." Inside, the fire burned low. Grace moved to add more wood, but Caleb took the log from her hand. His fingers brushed hers, calloused and warm. He set the log gentle into the flames and stood quiet a moment. "I was a quiet man before this," he said, surprising even himself. "Didn't think much of Maureen. Figured I'd grow old with a horse and a shotgun for company. But now I'm grateful the storm brought you." She looked at him, head tilted. "I never believed in fate, but I believe in second chances." Then she reached up and touched the edge of his jaw. Not a kiss, not yet, just her hand on his face, telling him without words, "I'm still here. I'm still standing." That night, they shared the bed, but it wasn't about heat. It was about quiet. It was about leaning into each other without fear. The world outside could do its worst. Inside these walls, they were safe. Together. Sometime near dawn, Grace whispered into the dark, "I think I could love you someday." And Caleb, eyes open to the shadows, whispered back, "Then I'll wait." Spring came early, but not gentle. The snow melted fast, flooding creeks and turning roads to muck. Grass came up sharp and green, and with it came new life and old trouble. Caleb and Grace worked the land side by side. She planted a garden, stubbornly till Lynn, with her bad ankle wrapped tight. He fixed the roof and built a second chair for the porch. Every nail he drove felt like an anchor dropped, saying, "I'm staying." But the peace couldn't last. It was Widow Morley who brought word. Jud Brody had been seen drinking at the Grange Tavern, talking loud about claiming what was his. Said he'd found a loophole in the marriage papers. Said if Caleb didn't yield, he'd take back Grace by force, or take her land and leave her begging in the dirt. Caleb didn't say a word when he heard, just oiled his rifle and checked the saddle cinch on his gelding. Grace watched him from the doorway. "You gonna go looking for him?" "No," Caleb said. "He's already looking for me." That night, the wind shifted. Grace couldn't sleep. She sat by the window, candle burning low, eyes fixed on the tree line. Just past midnight, she saw it. Smoke, not from the chimney, out in the woods. A small fire on the ridge. A signal. Or a threat. She woke Caleb with a whisper, and together they slipped outside. He led her to the barn, handed her the revolver she'd never thought she'd use again. "If he comes down that hill, you shoot," Caleb said. "Don't matter if it's him or a ghost. You don't freeze." She nodded. "And you?" He gave her a half-smile. "I don't freeze either." He rode out toward the ridge alone. The moonlight lit him silver, tall in the saddle like some kind of frontier knight, heading into battle with nothing but grit and God at his back. Grace waited. Minutes dragged like hours. Then she heard it, gunshots. 3 sharp cracks. Then silence. She ran to the porch, heart thundering. Shadows moved at the tree line. Then Caleb appeared, walking slow, lead in his horse. Blood on his sleeve, a limp in his step. Grace ran to him. "You shot." He shook his head. "Grazed. Jud won't be both airing us again." She stared at him, heart beating like a wild drum. "Is he dead?" Caleb looked away. "He's gone. That's all that matters." They stood there in the moonlight, the fire on the ridge still smoldering behind him, not speaking, just breathing. Finally, Grace said, "You didn't have to go." Caleb looked her in the eye. "Yeah, I did, because you're worth fighting for." And for the first time since that blizzard swept her into his life, she leaned in and kissed him, not out of duty, not out of gratitude, but because she wanted to. Spring fully broke like a fresh colt, sudden and full of kick. The last of the snow melted, and the land turned soft and green again. Streams ran clear, birds returned to the pines, and the cabin no longer groaned under winter's weight. Jud Brody was gone, whether to another town or to the next life. No one knew, and no one asked. The sheriff chalked it up to frontier justice and let it lie, and the town did what towns do best, forgot what made M uncomfortable and remembered only what gave M peace. But Caleb and Grace, they remembered it all. Every cold night, every sharp word, every choice made in desperation that somehow turned into devotion. Their days found a rhythm as natural as breathing. Grace's limp stayed, but so did her fire. She worked the land beside Caleb, grew beans and squash, and even started mending clothes for the townsfolk in exchange for eggs or coffee. She laughed more, smiled easier, and when she looked at Caleb now, it wasn't guarded. It was tender. Caleb, for his part, built her a table by the window where she could sew and watch the sun rise. He never said much, but his hand said plenty. Every board he nailed, every pot of stew he simmered when she was sore. One evening, she found him on the porch, reading from a worn old book she'd never seen before. He looked up, eyes soft beneath that wide-brimmed hat. "Never figured I'd get used to company," he said. "But now, I can't rightly picture this place without you." Grace stepped up beside him, took the book from his hands, and set it down. "You won't have to," she said. "I'm here. Not out of obligation, not 'cause the town forced us, but because I choose to be." He smiled, slow and quiet, like the sunrise. They didn't speak of love often. They didn't need to. It was in the way she filled his canteen before he rode out, in the way he waited for her at the gate after market, in every moment they shared, and every night they fell asleep beneath the same roof. A year passed, then another, and someday folks might speak of the blizzard that started it all, of the scandal that turned to something else, of the man who rescued a woman, and the woman who rescued him right back. But for Caleb and Grace Mason, none of that mattered much. They were just two souls, stitched together by snow, storm, and stubborn hearts, living out their days in a cabin that wasn't just a shelter. It was home.